The Murder on the Links by Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie is the best-selling author of as many as 80 novels and short story collections. Her name needs no introduction as her works have been adapted into various films and television series, translated into 45 languages and appreciated by more than 2 billion readers all over the world. Now we can start her one of the great creation, The Murder on the Links. Part 1. A Fellow Traveler. I believe that a well-known anecdote exists to the effect that a young writer, determined to make the commencement of his story forcible and original enough to catch and rivet the attention of the most blase of editors, penned the following sentence: "Hell," said the Duchess. Strangely enough, this tale of mine opened in much the same fashion, only the lady who gave utterance to the exclamation was not a duchess. It was a day in early June. I had been transacting some business in Paris and was returning by the morning service to London, where I was still sharing rooms with my old friend, the Bulgarian ex-detective Hercule Poirot. The Calais Express was singularly empty. In fact, my own compartment held only one other traveler. I had made a somewhat hurried departure from the hotel and was busy assuring myself that I had duly collected all my traps when the train started. Up till then I had hardly noticed my companion, but I was now violently recalled to the fact of her existence. Jumped up from her seat, she let down the window and stuck her head out, withdrawing it a moment later with the brief and forcible ejaculation, "Hell! Now I am old-fashioned. A woman, I consider, should be womanly. I have no patience with the modern neurotic girl who jazzes from morning to night, smokes like a chimney, and uses languages which would make the Billingsgate fishwoman blush." I looked up, frowning slightly, into a pretty, impudent face, surmounted by a rakish little red hat. A thick cluster of black curls hid each ear. I judged that she was little more than 17, but her face was covered with powder and her lips were quietly, impossibly scarlet. Nothing abashed, she returned my glance and executed an expressive grimace. "Dear me, we have shocked the kind gentleman," she observed to an imaginary audience. "I apologize for my language, most unladylike and all that, but oh Lord, that is reason enough for it. Do you know, I have lost my only sister?" "Really?" I said politely. "How unfortunate." "He disapproves," remarked the lady. "He disapproves utterly of me and my sister, which last is unfair, because he hasn't seen her." I opened my mouth, but she forestalled me. "Say no more. Nobody loves me. I shall go into the garden and eat worms. Boo-hoo, I am crushed." She buried herself behind a large comic French paper. In a minute or two, I saw her eyes stealthily peeping at me over the top. In spite of myself, I could not help smiling, and in a minute she had tossed the paper aside and had burst into a merry peal of laughter. I know, you were in such a mud as you looked, she cried. Her laughter was so infectious that I could not help join in, though I hardly cared for the word mud. There, now we are friends, declared the minx. Say, you are sorry about my sister. I am desolated. That is a good boy. Let me finish. I was going to add that, although I am desolated, I can manage to put up with her absence very well. I made a little bow. But this most unaccountable of damsels frowned and shook her head. Cut it out. I prefer the dignified disapproval stunt. Oh, your face, not one of us, it said, and you were right there, though, mind you, it is pretty hard to tell. Nowadays, it is not everyone who can distinguish between a demi and a duchess. There now, I believe I have shocked you again. You have been dug out of the backwoods. You have. Not that I mind that. We could do with a few more of your sort. I just hate a fellow who gets fresh. It makes me mad. She shook her head vigorously. What are you like when you are mad? I enquired with a smile. A regular little devil. Don't care what I say or what I do either. I nearly did a chap in once. Yes, really. I have deserved it too. Well, I begged, don't get mad with me. I shan't. I like you. Did the first moment I set eyes on you. But you looked so disapproving that I never thought we should make friends. Well, we have. Tell me something about yourself. I am an actress. No, not the kind you are thinking of. I have been on the boards since I was a kid of 6. Tumbling. I beg your pardon, I said puzzled. Haven't you ever seen child acrobats? Oh, I understand. I am American born, but I have spent most of my life in England. We have got a new show now. We, my sister and I, sort of song and dance, and a bit of patter and a dash of the old business thrown in. It is quite a new idea and it hits them every time. There is going to be money in it. My new acquaintance leaned forward and discoursed volubly, a great many of her terms being quite unintelligible to me. Yet I found myself evincing an increasing interest in her. She seemed such a curious mixture of child and a woman, though perfectly worldly wise and able, as she expressed it, to take care of herself. There was yet something curiously ingenious in her single-minded attitude towards life, and her wholehearted determination to make good. We passed through Amiens. The name awakened many memories. My companion seemed to have an intuitive knowledge of what was in my mind. Thinking of the war, I nodded. You were taught it, I suppose, pretty well. I was wounded once, and after the Somme, they invalidated me out altogether. I am a sort of private secretary now to an MP. My, that is brainy. No, it isn't. There is really awfully little to do. Usually a couple of hours every day seem me through. It is dull work too. In fact, I don't know what I should do if I hadn't got something to fall back upon. Don't say you collect bugs. No, I share rooms with a very interesting man. He is a Belgian, an ex-detective. He is set up as a private detective in London, and he is doing extraordinarily well. He is really a very marvelous little man. Time and again he has proved to be right where the official police have failed. My companion listened with widening eyes. Isn't that interesting now? I just adore crime. I go to all the mysteries on the movies, and when there is a murder on, I just devour the papers. Do you remember the Styles case? I asked. Let me see. Was that the old lady who was poisoned somewhere down in Essex? I nodded. That was Poirot's first big case, undoubtedly. But for him, the murder would have escaped scot-free. It was a most wonderful bit of detective work. Warming to my subject, I ran over the heads of the affair, working up to the triumphant and unexpected denouement. The girl listened, spellbound. In fact, we were so absorbed that the train drew into Calais station before we realized it. I secured a couple of porters and we alighted on the platform. My companion held out her hand. Goodbye, and I will mind my language better in future. Oh, but surely you will let me look after you on the boat? Mayn't be on the boat. I have got to see whether that sister of mine got aboard after all anywhere. But thanks, all the same. Oh, but we are going to meet again, surely? Aren't you even going to tell me your name? I cried as she turned away. She looked over her shoulder. Cinderella, she said, and laughed. But little did I think when and how I should see Cinderella again. Chapter 2. An Appeal for Help. It was 5 minutes past 9 when I entered our joint sitting room for breakfast on the following morning. My friend Poirot, exact to the minute as usual, was just tapping the shell of his second egg. He beamed upon me as I entered. You have slept well, yes? You have recovered from the crossing? So terrible? It is a marvel. Almost you are exact this morning. Pardon. But your tie is not symmetrical. Permit that I rearrange him. Elsewhere, I have described Hercule Poirot, an extraordinary little man, height 5 feet 4 inches. Egg-shaped head carries a little to one side. Eyes that shone green when he was excited. Stiff military mustache. Air of dignity immense. He was neat and dandified in appearance. For neatness of any kind, he had an absolute passion. To see an ornament set crookedly, or a speck of dust, or a slight disarray in one's attire, was torture to the little man until he could ease his feelings by remedying the matter. Order and method were his gods. He had a certain disdain for tangible evidence such as footprints and cigarette ash, and would maintain that, taken by themselves, they would never enable a detective to solve a problem. Then he would tap his egg-shaped head with absurd complacency and remark with great satisfaction, "The true work, it is done from within, the little grey cells. Remember always the little grey cells, mon ami." I slipped into my seat and remarked idly, in answer to Poirot's greeting, that an hour's sea passage from Calais to Dover could hardly be dignified by the epithet Terrible. Anything interesting come by the post? I asked. Poirot shook his head with a dissatisfied air. I have not yet examined my letters, but nothing of interest arrives nowadays. The great criminals, the criminals of method, they do not exist. He shook his head despondently and roared with laughter. Cheer up, Poirot. The luck will change. Open your letters. For all you know, there may be a great case looming on the horizon. Poirot smiled and taking up the neat little letter opener with which he opened his correspondence, he slit the top of the several envelope that lay by his plate. A bill, another bill. It is that I grow extravagant in my old age. Ah, a note from Jap. Yes, I picked up my ears. The Scotland Yard inspector had more than once introduced us to an interesting case. He merely thanks me, in his fashion, for a little point the Aberystwyth case on which I was able to set him right. I am delighted to have been of service to him. Poirot continued to read his correspondence placidly. A suggestion that I should give a lecture to our local Boy Scouts. The Countess of Forfenock will be obliged if I will call and see her. Another lapdog without doubt. And now, for the last. Oh, I looked up, took to notice the change of tone. Poirot was reading attentively. In a minute, he tossed the sheet over to me. This is out of ordinary, mon ami. Read for yourself. The letter was written on a foreign type of paper in a bold, characteristic hand. Villa Geneve, Merlinville, Surmer, France. Dear Sir, I am in need of the service of a detective and for reasons which I will give you later. Do not wish to call in the official police. I have heard of you from several quarters, and all reports go to show that you are not only a man of decided ability, but one who also know how to be discreet. I do not wish to trust details to the post, but on account of a secret I possess, I go in daily fear of my life. I am convinced that the danger is imminent, and therefore I beg that you will lose no time in crossing to France. I will send a car to meet you at Calais. If you will wire me when you are arriving, I shall be obliged if you will drop all cases you have on hand and devote yourself solely to my interests. I am prepared to pay any compensation necessary. I shall probably need your service for a considerable period of time, as it may be necessary for you to go out to Santiago, where I spent several years of my life. I shall be content for you to name your own fee, assuring you once more that the matter is urgent. Yours faithfully, P.T. Renaud. Below the signature was a hastily scrawled line, almost illegible. For God's sake, come. I handed the letter back with quickened pulses. At last, I said, here is something distinctly out of the ordinary. Yes, indeed, said Poirot meditatively. You will go, of course, I continued. Poirot nodded. He was thinking deeply. Finally, he seemed to make up his mind and glanced up at the clock. His face was very grave. See you, my friend. There is no time to lose. The Continental Express leaves Victoria at o'clock. Do not agitate yourself. There is plenty of time. We can allow 10 minutes for discussion. You accompany me. Next, Cephas. Well, you told me yourself that your employer needed you, not for the next few weeks. Oh, that is all right. But this Mr. Ronald hits strongly that his business is private. Ta, I will manage. M. Ronald. By the way, I see to know the name. There is a well-known South American millionaire fellow. His name's Ronald. I don't know whether it could be the same, but without a doubt that explains the mention of San Diego. San Diego is in Chile, and Chile is the South America. Oh, but we progress finely. You remarked the postscript. How did it strike you? I considered. Clearly, he wrote the letter, keeping himself well in hand, but at the end of self-control snapped and, on the impulse of the moment, he scrawled those four desperate words. But my friend shook his head energetically. You are in error. See you note that, while the ink of the signature is nearly black, that of the postscript is quite pale. Well, I said, puzzled. Mon Dieu, mon ami. But use your little grey cells. Is it not obvious? Mr. Ronald wrote his letter without blotting it. He read it carefully. Then, not an impulse, but deliberately, he added those last words and blotted the sheet. But why? Parbleu, so that it should produce the effect upon me that it had upon you. What? Mais oui. To make sure of my coming, he read the letter and was dissatisfied. It was not strong enough. He paused and then added softly, his eyes shining with that green light that always betokened inward excitement. And so, mon ami, since that postscript was added, not on impulse, but soberly, in cold blood, the urgency is very great and we must reach him as soon as possible. Merlinville, I murmured thoughtfully. I have heard of it, I think. Poirot nodded. It is a quiet little place, but chic. It lies about midway between Boulogne and Calais. Mr. Ronald has a house in England, I suppose? Yes, in Rutland Gate, as far as I remember. Also a big place in country, somewhere in Hertfordshire. But I really know very little about him. He doesn't do much in a social way. I believe he has large South American interests in the city, and he spent most of his life out in Chile and Argentina. Well, we shall hear all the details from the man himself. Come, let us pack a small suitcase each and then a taxi to Victoria. 11 o'clock saw our departure from Victoria on our way to Dover. Before starting, Poirot had dispatched a telegram to Mr. Ronald giving the time of our arrival at Calais. I am surprised you haven't invested in few bottles of some seasick remedy, Poirot, I observed maliciously as I recalled our conversation at breakfast. My friend, who was anxiously scanning the weather, turned a reproachful face upon me. Is it that you have forgotten the method most excellent of Leverger, his system. I practice it always. One balances oneself. If you remember, turning the head from left to right, breathing in and out, counting 6 between each breath. I demurred. You will be rather tired of balancing yourself and counting 6 by the time you get to Santiago or Buenos Aires or wherever it is you land. Killy ID. You do not figure to yourself that I shall go to Santiago. Mr. Renault suggests it is in his letter. He did not know the method of Hercule Poirot. I do not run to and fro, making journeys and agitating myself. My work is done from within here. He tapped his forehead significantly. As usual, this remark roused my argumentative faculty. It is all very well, Poirot, but I think you are falling into the habit of displacing certain things too much. A fingerprint has led sometimes to the arrest and conviction of a murder, and has, without doubt, hanged more than one innocent man, remarked Poirot dryly. But surely the study of fingerprint and footprints, cigarette ash, different kinds of mud, and other clues that comprise the minute observation of details, all these are of vital importance. But certainly I have never said otherwise. The trained observer, the expert, without a doubt he is useful. But the others, the Hercule Poirot, they are above the experts. To them, the expert bring the facts. Their business is the method of the crime, its logical deduction, the proper sequence and order of the facts, above all, the true psychology of the case. You have hunted the fox? Yes, I have hunted a bit now and again, I said, rather bewildered by this abrupt change of subject. Why? And beyond this hunting of fox, you need the dog now? No. Horns, I corrected gently. Yes, of course. But yet, Poirot wagged his finger at me. You did not descend from your horse and run along the ground, smelling with your nose and uttering loud oh-ohs. In spite of myself, I laughed immoderately. Poirot nodded in a satisfied manner. So, you leave the work of the horns to the horns. Yet you demand that I, Hercule Poirot, should make myself ridiculous by laying down, possibly on damp grass, to study hypothetical footprints and should scoop up cigarette ash when I do not know one kind from the other. Remember the Plymouth Express mystery. The good Jeb departed to make a survey of the railway line. When he returned, I, without having moved from my apartments, was able to tell him exactly what he had found. So, you are of the opinion that Jeb wasted his time? Not at all, since his evidence confirmed by theory. But I should have wasted my time if I had gone. It is the same with the so-called experts. Remember the handwriting testimony in the Cavendish case. One counsel's questioning brings out a testimony as to the resemblances. The difference brings evidence to show dissimilarity. All the language is very technical, and the result, what we all knew in the first place. The writing was very like that of John Cavendish, and the psychological mind is faced with the question, why? Because it was actually his, or because someone wished us to think it was his. I answered that question, mon ami, and answered it correctly. And Poirot, having effectually silenced, if not convinced me, leaned back with a satisfied air. On the boat, I knew better than to disturb my friend's solitude. The weather was gorgeous, and the sea as smooth as the proverbial millpond. So I was hardly surprised when a smiling Poirot joined me on disembarking at Calais. A disappointment was in store for us, as no car had been sent to meet us. But Poirot put this down to his telegram having been delayed in transit. "We will hire a car," he said cheerfully, and a few minutes later saw us creaking and jolting along in the most ramshackle of automobiles that ever plied for hire in the direction of Merlinville. My spirits were at their highest, but my little friend was observing me gravely. "You are what the Scotch people call fey, Hastings. It presages disaster." "Nonsense. At any rate, you do not share my feelings." "No, but I am afraid." "Afraid of what?" "I do not know, but I have the premonition. A genie says quay." He spoke so gravely that I was impressed in spite of myself. "I have a feeling," he said slowly, "that this is going to be a big affair, a long, troublesome problem that will not be easy to work out." I would have questioned him further, but we were just coming into the little town of Merlinville, and we slowed up to inquire the way to the Villa Genevieve. "Straight on, monsieur, through the town. The Villa Genevieve is about half a mile the other side. You cannot miss it. A big villa overlooking the sea." We thanked our informant and drove on, leaving the town behind. A fork in the road brought us to a second halt. A peasant was trudging towards us, and we waited for him to come up to us in order to ask the way again. There was a tiny villa standing right by the road, but it was too small and dilapidated to be the one we wanted. As we waited, the gate of it swung open and a girl came out. The peasant was passing us now, and the driver leaned forward from his seat and asked for direction. "The Villa Genevieve, just a few steps up this road to the right, monsieur. You could see it if it were not for the curve." The chauffeur thanked him and started the car again. My eyes were fascinated by the girl, who still stood with one hand on the gate, watching us. I am an admirer of beauty, and here was one whom nobody could have passed without remark. Very tall, with the proportions of a young goddess, her uncovered golden head gleaming in the sunlight. I swore to myself that she was one of the most beautiful girls I had ever seen. As we swung up the rough road, I turned my head to look after her. "By Jove, Poirot," I exclaimed, "did you see that young goddess?" Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Commence," he murmured. "Already you have seen a goddess? But hang it all, wasn't she?" "Possibly. I did not remark the fact." "Surely you noticed her?" "Mon ami, two people rarely see the same thing. You, for instance, saw a goddess." He hesitated. "Yes, I saw only a girl with anxious eyes," and Poirot gravely. "But at that moment we drew up at a big green gate, and simultaneously we both uttered an exclamation. Before it stood an imposing Sergeant de Ville. He held up his hand to bar our way. You cannot pass, monsieur, but we wish to see Mr. Renault. I cried. We have an appointment. This is his villa, isn't it? Yes, monsieur, but Poirot leaned forward. But what? Monsieur Renault was murdered this morning. Chapter 3. At the Villa Geneve. In a moment, Poirot had leaped from the car. His eyes blazed with excitement. What is that you say? Murder. When? How? The Sergeant de Ville drew himself up. I cannot answer any question, monsieur. True, I comprehend. Poirot reflected for a minute. The commissary of police. He is without doubt within. Yes, monsieur. Poirot took out a card and scribbled a few words on it. Viola, will you have the goodness to see that this card is sent in to the commissary at once? The man took it and, turning his head over his shoulder, whistled. In a few seconds, a comrade joined him and was handed Poirot's message. There was a wait of some minutes, and then a short, stout man with a huge moustache came bustling down to the gate. The Sergeant de Ville saluted and stood aside. My dear Monsieur Poirot, cried the newcomer, I am delighted to see you. Your arrival is most opportune. Poirot's face had lighted up. Monsieur Bex, this is indeed a pleasure. He turned to me. This is an English friend of mine, Captain Hastings, monsieur. Lucien Bex. The commissary and I bowed to each other ceremoniously, and M. Bex turned once more to Poirot. Mon vieux, I have not seen you since 1909. That I am in Ostend. You have information to give which may assist us, possibly. You know it already. You were aware that I had been sent for? No. By whom? The dead man. It seems that he knew an attempt was going to be made on his life. Unfortunately, he sent for me too late. Sacré tonnerre, ejaculated the Frenchman. So he foresaw his own murder. That upsets our theories considerably. But come inside. He held the gate open, and we commenced walking towards the house. M. Bex continued to talk. The examining magistrate, Monsieur Hortet, must hear of this at once. He has just finished examining the scenes of the crime and is about to begin his interrogations. When was the crime committed? Asked Poirot. The body was discovered this morning about 9 o'clock. Madame Renault's evidence and that of the doctors goes to show that death must have occurred about 2 a.m. But enter, I pray of you. We had arrived at the steps which led up to the front door of the villa. In the hall another Sergeant de Ville was sitting. He rose at sight of the commissary. Where is Monsieur Hortet now? Inquired the latter. In the salon, monsieur. M. Bex opened a door to the left of the hall, and we passed in. M. Hortet and his clerk were sitting at a big round table. They looked up as we entered. The commissary introduced us and explained our presence. M. Hortet, the juge d'instruction, was a tall, gaunt man with piercing dark eyes and a neatly cut grey beard, which he had a habit of caressing as he talked. Standing by the mantelpiece was an elderly man with slightly stooping shoulders, who was introduced to us as Dr. Durand. Most extraordinary, remarked M. Hortet, as the commissary finishing speaking. You have the letter here, Monsieur. Poirot handed it to him, and the magistrate read it. He speaks of a secret. What a pity he was not more explicit. We are much indebted to you, Monsieur Poirot. I hope you will do us the honor of assisting us in our investigations, or you obliged to return to London, Monsieur Lee Jude. I propose to remain. I did not arrive in time to prevent my client's death, but I feel myself bound in honor to discover the assassin. The magistrate bowed. These sentiments do you honor also. Without doubt, Madame Renault will wish to retain your services. We are expecting M. Gerard from the surety in Paris any moment, and I am sure that you and he will be able to give each other mutual assistance in your investigations. In the meantime, I hope that you will do me the honor to be present at my interrogations, and I need hardly say that if there is any assistance you require, it is at your disposal. I thank you, Monsieur. You will comprehend that at present I am completely in the dark. I know nothing whatever. M. Hortet nodded to the commissary, and the latter took up the tale. This morning, the old servant, Francois, on descending to start her work, found the front door ajar. Feeling a momentary alarm as to burglars, she looked into the dining room, but seeing the silver was safe, she thought no more about it, concluding that her master had, without doubt, risen early and gone for a stroll. Pardon, Monsieur, for interrupting, but was that a common practice of his? No, it was not. But old Francois has the common idea as regards the English, that they are mad and liable to do the most unaccountable things at any moment. Going to call her mistress as usual. A young maid, Leonie, was horrified to discover her ganged and bound, and almost at the same moment news was brought that Monsieur Renault's body had been discovered, stone dead, stabbed in the back. Where? That is one of the most extraordinary features of the case, Monsieur Poirot. The body was lying face downward in an open grave. What? Yes, the pit was freshly dug, just a few yards outside the boundary of the villa grounds, and it had been dead. How long? Dr. Durand answered this. I examined the body this morning at 10 o'clock. Death must have taken place at least 7 and possibly 10 hours previously. That fixes it at between midnight and 2 a.m. Exactly, and Mrs. Renault's evidence places it at after 2 a.m., which narrows the field still further. Death must have been instantaneous and naturally could not have been self-inflicted. Poirot nodded, and the commissary resumed. Madame Reynolds was hastily freed from the cords that bound her by the horrified servants. She was in a terrible condition of weakness, almost unconscious from the pain of her bonds. It appeared that two masked men entered the bedroom, gagged and bound her, while forcibly abducting her husband. This we know at second hand from the servant. On hearing the tragic news, she fell at once into an alarming state of agitation. On arrival, Dr. Durant immediately prescribed a sedative, and we have not yet been able to question her. But without doubt, she will awake more calm and be equal to bearing the strain of the interrogation, the commissioner posed, and the inmates of the house. Monsieur, there is old Francois, the housekeeper. She lived for many years with the former owners of the Ville Genevieve. Then there are two young girls, sisters, Denise and Leonie Ollard. Their home is in Merlinville, and they come from most respectable parents. Then there is the chauffeur, who Monsieur Reynolds brought over from England with him, but he is away on a holiday. Finally, there are Madame Reynolds and her son, Monsieur Jacques Reynolds. He too is away from home at present. Perrot bowed his head. Hotet spoke. Marchot. The sergeant de Ville appeared. Bring in the woman, Francois. The man saluted and disappeared. In a moment or two, he returned, escorting the frightened Francois. Your name is Francois Arichet. Yes, Monsieur. You have been a long time in service at the Ville Genevieve, 11 years with Madame la Vicomtesse. Then, when she sold the villa this spring, I consented to remain on with the English miller. Never did I imagine. The magistrate cut her short. Without doubt. Now, Francois, in this matter of the front door, whose business was it to fasten it at night? Mine, Monsieur. Always I saw to it myself. At last night, I fastened it as usual. You are sure of that? I swear it by the blessed saint, Monsieur. That time? What time would that be? The same time as usual, 10:30, Monsieur. What about the rest of the household? Had they gone up to bed? Madame had retired some time before. Denise and Leonie went up with me. Monsieur was still in his study. Then, if anyone unfastened the door afterwards, it must have been Monsieur Reynolds himself. Francois shrugged her broad shoulders. What should he do that for? With robbers and assassins passing every minute? A nice idea. Monsieur was not an imbecile. It is not as though he had to let the lady out. The magistrate interrupted sharply. The lady? What lady do you mean? Why, the lady who came to see him. Had a lady been to see him that evening? But yes, Monsieur, and many other evenings as well. Who was she? Did you know her? A rather cunning look spread over woman's face. How should I know who it was? She grumbled. I did not let her in last night. Aha, wrote the examining magistrate, bringing his hand down with a bang on the table. You would trifle with the police, would you? I demand that you tell me at once the name of this woman who came to visit Monsieur Ronald in that evenings. Police, the police, grumbled Francois. Never did I think that I should be mixed up with the police, but I know well enough who she was. It was Madame d'Aubrigal. The commissary uttered an exclamation and leaned forward as though in utter astonishment. Madame d'Aubrigal from the Ville Marguerite just down the road? That is what I said, monsieur. Oh, she is pretty one. The old woman tossed her head scornfully. Madame d'Aubrigal, murmured the commissary. Impossible. Viola, grumbled Francois. That is all you get for telling the truth. Not at all, said the examining magistrate soothingly. We were surprised, that is all. Madame d'Aubrigal then, and Monsieur Renaud they were. He paused delicately. Ah, it was that, without doubt. How should I know? But what will you? Monsieur, he was Milord Anglaise, Tres Richie, and Madame d'Aubrigal, she was poor. That one, and Tres chic, for all that she lives so quietly with her daughter. Not a doubt of it. She has had her history. She is no longer young, but ma foi, I who speak to you have seen the men's heads turn after her as she goes down the street. Besides, lately she had had more money to spend. All the town knows it. The little economies, they are at an end. And Francois shook her head with an air of unalterable certainty. M. Hortet stroked his beard reflectively. And Madame Renaud, he asked at length, how did she take this friendship? Francois shrugged her shoulders. She was always most amiable, most polite. One would say that she suspected nothing, but all the same, it is not so. The heart suffers, monsieur. Day by day, I have watched Madame grow paler and thinner. She was not the same woman who arrived here a month ago. Monsieur, too, has changed. He also has had his worries. One could see that he was on the brink of a crisis of the nerves. And who could wonder, with an affair conducted in such a fashion? No reticence, no discretion, style, angels, without doubt. I bounded indignantly in my seat, but the examining magistrate was continuing his questions, undistracted by side issues. You say that Monsieur Renaud had not to let Madame d'Aubrigal out. Had she left then? Yes, monsieur. I heard them come out of the study and go to the door. Monsieur said good night and shut the door after her. What time was that? About 25 minutes after 10, monsieur. Do you know when Monsieur Renaud went to bed? I heard him come up about 10 minutes after we did. The stair creaks so that one hears everyone who goes up and down, and that is all. You heard no sound of disturbance during the night? Nothing, whatever, monsieur. Which of the servants came down the first in the morning? I did, Monsieur. At once I saw the door swinging open. What about the other downstairs windows? Were they all fastened? Every one of them. There was nothing suspicious or out of place anywhere. Good, Francois, you can go. The old woman shuffled toward the door. On the threshold she looked back. I will tell you one thing, Monsieur, that Madame d'Aubigny, she is a bad one. Oh yes, one woman knows about another. She is a bad one. Remember that. And shaking her head sagely, Francois left the room. Leonie Allard called magistrate. Leonie appeared dissolved in tears and inclined to be hysterical. M. Hotet dealt with her adroitly. Her evidence was mainly concerned with the discovery of her mistress, gauged and bound of which she gave rather an exaggerated account. She, like Francois, had heard nothing during the night. Her sister, Denise, succeeded her. She agreed that her master had changed greatly of late. Every day he became more and more morose. He ate less. He was always depressed, but Denise had her own theory. Without doubt, it was the mafia he had on his track. Two masked men. Who else could it be? A terrible society that. It is, of course, possible, said the magistrate smoothly. Now, my girl, was it you who admitted Madame d'Aubigny to the house last night? Not last night, Monsieur, the night before. But Francois has just told us that Madame d'Aubigny was here last night. No, Monsieur, a lady did come to see Monsieur Renault last night, but it was not Madame d'Aubigny. Surprised, the magistrate insisted, but the girl held firm. She knew Madame d'Aubigny perfectly by sight. This lady was dark also, but shorter and much younger. Nothing could shake her statement. Had you ever seen this lady before? Never, Monsieur. And then the girl added differently, but I think she was English. English? Yes, Monsieur. She asked for Monsieur Renault in quite good French, but the accent, however slight, one can always tell it. Besides, when they came out of the study, they were speaking in English. Did you hear what they said? Could you understand it? I mean, me. I speak English very well, she said with pride. The lady was speaking too fast for me to catch what she said, but I heard Monsieur's last words as he opened the door for her. She paused and then repeated carefully and laboriously, yes, yes, but for God's sake, go now. Yes, yes, but for God's sake, go now, repeated the magistrate. He dismissed Denise and after a moment or two for consideration, recalled Francois to her. He propounded the question as to whether she had not made a mistake in fixing the night of Madame d'Aubigny's visit. Francois, however, proved unexpectedly obstinate. It was last night that Madame d'Aubigny had come. Without doubt, it was she. Denise wished to make herself interesting, Viola thought. So she had cooked up this fine tale about a strange lady, airing her knowledge of English too. Probably Monsieur had never spoken that sentence in English at all, and even if he had, it proved nothing, for Madame d'Aubigny spoke English perfectly and generally used that language when talking to Monsieur and Madame Renault. You see, Monsieur Jacques, the son of Monsieur was usually rare, and he spoke French very badly. The magistrate did not insist. Instead, he inquired about the chauffeur and learned that only yesterday Monsieur Renault had declared that he was not likely to use the car, and that masters might just as well take a holiday. A perplexed frown was beginning to gather between Poirot's eyes. "What is it?" I whispered. He shook his head impatiently and asked a question. "Pardon, Monsieur Bex, but without doubt Monsieur Renault could drive the car himself?" The commissary looks over at Francois, and the old woman replied promptly, "No, Monsieur did not drive himself." Poirot's frown deepened. "I wish you would tell me what is worrying you," I said impatiently. "See you not? In this letter, Monsieur Renault speaks of sending the car for me to Calais." "Perhaps he meant a hired car," I suggested. "Doubtless, that is so. But why hire a car when you have one of your own? Why choose yesterday to send away the chauffeur on a holiday? Suddenly, at a moment's notice? Was it that for some reason he wanted him out of the way before we arrived?" Chapter 4. The letter signed Bella. Francois had left the room. The magistrate was drumming thoughtfully on the table. "Monsieur Bex," he said at length, "here we have directly conflicting testimony. Which are we to believe, Francois or Denis?" "Denis," said the commissary decidedly. "It was she who let the visitor in. Francois is old and obstinate, and has evidently taken a dislike to Madame d'Aubrigal. Besides, our own knowledge tends to show that Renault was entangled with another woman." "Tains," cried M. Hotet, "we have forgotten to inform Monsieur Poirot of that." He searched among the papers on the table and finally handed the one he was in search of to my friend. "This letter, Monsieur Poirot, we found in the pocket of the dead man's overcoat." Poirot took it and unfolded it. It was somewhat warm and crumpled, and was written in English in a rather unformed hand. "My dearest one, why have you not written for so long? You do love me still, don't you? Your letters lately have been so different, cold and strange, and now this long silence. It makes me afraid if you were to stop loving me, but that is impossible. What a silly kid I am. I always imagining things, but if you did stop loving me, I don't know what I should do. Kill myself, perhaps. I couldn't live without you. Sometimes I fancy another woman in coming between us. Let her look out, that is all. And you too. I would as soon kill you as let her have you. I mean it. But there, I am writing high flown nonsense. You love me, and I love you. Yes, love you, love you, love you. Your own adoring Bella." There was no address or date. Poirot handed it back with a grave face. "And the assumption is?" The examining magistrate shrugged his shoulders. "Obviously, Monsieur Renault was entangled with this English woman, Bella. He comes over here, meets Madame d'Aubrigal, and starts an intrigue with her. He cools off to the other, and she instantly suspects something. This letter contains a distinct threat." Monsieur Poirot at first sighed, The case seemed simplicity itself. Jealousy. The fact that Monsieur Renault was stabbed into the back seemed to point distinctly to its being a woman's crime. Poirot nodded. The stab in the back, yes, but not the grave. That was laborious work, hard work. No woman dug that grave, Monsieur. That was a man's doing. The commissary exclaimed excitedly. Yes, yes, you are right. We did not think that. As I said, continued Hortet. At first sight, the case seemed simple, but the masked men and the letter you received from Monsieur Renault complicate matters. Here we seem to have an entirely different set of circumstances with no relationship between the two. As regards the letters written to yourself, do you think it is possible that it referred in any way to this Bella and her treats? Poirot shook his head. Hardly. A man like Monsieur Renault, who had led an adventurous life in out-of-the-way places, would not be likely to ask for protection against a woman. The examining magistrate nodded his head emphatically. My view exactly. Then we must look for the explanation of the letter. In Santiago, finished the commissary. I shall cable without delay to the police in that city, requesting full detail of the murdered man's life out there, his love affairs, his business transactions, his friendship, and many enmities he may have incurred. It will be strange if, after that, we do not hold a clue to his mysterious murder. The commissary looked around for approval. Excellent, said Poirot appreciatively. You have found no other letters from this Bella among Monsieur Renault's effects? Asked Poirot. No, of course. One of our first proceedings was to search through his private papers in the study. We found nothing of interest. However, all seemed square and above board. The only thing at all out of the ordinary was his will. Here it is. Poirot ran through the document. So, a legacy of £1,000 to Mr. Stoner. Who is he, by the way? Monsieur Renault's secretary. He remained in England, but was over here once or twice for a weekend, and everything else left unconditionally to his beloved wife, Eloise. Simply drawn up, but perfectly legal, witnessed by the two servants, Denise and Francois. Nothing so very unusual about that. He handed it back. Perhaps, began Bugs, you did not notice the date. Tingled Poirot. But yes, I noticed it. A fortnight ago. Possibly it marks his first intimation of danger. Many rich men die in this state through never considering the likelihood of their demise. But it is dangerous to draw conclusions prematurely. It points, however, to his having a real liking and fondness for his wife, in spite of his amorous intrigues. Yes, said Hortet doubtfully, but it is possibly a little unfair on his son, since it leaves him entirely dependent on his mother. If she were to marry again, and her second husband obtain an ascendancy over her, this boy might never touch a penny of his father's money. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. Man is a vain animal. Monsieur Renault figured to himself, without doubt, that his widow would never marry again. As to the son, it may have been a wise precaution to leave the money in his mother's hand. The sons of rich men are proverbially wild. It may be as you say. Now, Monsieur Poirot, you would without doubt like to visit the scene of the crime. I am sorry that the body has been removed, but of course photographs have been taken from every conceivable angle and will be at your disposal as soon as they are available. I thank you, Monsieur, for all your courtesy. The commissary rose. Come with me, messieurs. He opened the door and bowed ceremoniously to Poirot to precede him. Poirot, with equal politeness, drew back and bowed to the commissary. Monsieur, Monsieur. At last they got out into the hall. That room there, it is the study, Hein? Asked Poirot suddenly, nodding towards the door opposite. Yes, you would like to see it. He threw open the door as he spoke, and he entered. The room which M. Ronald had chosen for his own particular use was small but furnished with great taste and comfort. A businesslike writing desk with many pigeonholes stood in the window. Two large leather-covered armchairs faced the fireplace, and between them was a round table covered with the latest books and magazines. Poirot stood a moment, taking in the room. Then he stepped forward, passing his hand lightly over the backs of the leather chairs, picked up a magazine from the table, and drew a finger gingerly over the surface of the oak sideboard. His face expressed complete approval. No dust? I asked with a smile. He beamed on me, appreciative of my knowledge of his peculiarities. Not a particle, mon ami, and for once perhaps it is a pity. His sharp, bird-like eyes darted here and there. Ah, he remarked suddenly, with an intonation of relief. The hearthrug is crooked, and he bent down to straighten it. Suddenly, he uttered an exclamation and rose. In his hand, he held a small fragment of pink paper. In France, as in England, he remarked, the domestics omit to sweep under the mats. Bex took the fragment from him, and I came close to examine it. You recognize it, eh, Hastings? I shook my head, puzzled, and yet that particular shade of pink paper was very familiar. The commissionary's mental processes were quicker than mine. A fragment of a check, he exclaimed. The piece of paper was roughly about 2 inches square. On it was written in ink the word Duveen. Bain, said Bex, this check was payable to or drawn by someone named Duveen. The former, I fancy, said Poirot. For it I am not mistaken. The handwriting is that of Monsieur Renault. That was soon established by comparing it with a memorandum from the desk. Dear me, murmured the commissary with the crestfallen air. I really cannot imagine how I came to overlook this. Poirot laughed. The moral of that is, always look under the mats. My friend Hastings here will tell you that anything in the least crooked is a torment to me. As soon as I saw that the hearthrug was out of the straight, I said to myself, Tains, the legs of the chair caught it in being pushed back. Possibly there may be something beneath it which the good Francois overlooked. Francois or Denis or Leonie, whoever did this room, Since there is no dust, the room must have been done this morning. I reconstruct the incident like this. Yesterday, possibly last night, Monsieur Renault drew a check to the order of someone named Duveen. Afterward, it was torn up and scattered on the floor this morning. But Mbex was already pulling impatiently at the bell. Francois answered it. Yes, there had been a lot of pieces of paper on the floor. What has she done with this? Put them in the kitchen stove, of course. What else? With a gesture of despair, Bex dismissed her. Then his face lightening, he ran to the desk. In a minute, he was hunting through the dead man's checkbook. Then he repeated his former gesture. The last counterfoil was blank. Courage, cried Pirate, clapping him to the back. Without doubt, Madame Renault will be able to tell us all about this mysterious person named Duveen. The commissary's face cleared. Then, that is true. Let us proceed. As we turned to leave the room, Poirot remarked casually, it was here that Monsieur Renault received his guest last night, eh? It was, but how did you know? By this, I found it on the back of the leather chair, and he held up between his finger and thumb a long black hair, a woman's hair. Mbex took us out by the back of the house to where there was a small shed leaning against the house. He produced a key from this pocket and unlocked it. The body is here. We moved it from the scene of the crime just before you arrived, as the photographers had done with it. He opened the door and we passed in. The murdered man lay on the ground with a sheet over him. Mbex dexterously whipped off the covering. Renault was a man of medium height, slender and lithe in figure. He looked about 50 years age, and his dark hair was plentifully streaked with grey. He was clean-shaven with a long thin nose and eyes set rather close together, and his skin was deeply bronzed, as that of a man who had spent most of his life beneath tropical skies. His lips were drawn back from his teeth, and an expression of absolute amazement and terror was stamped on the livid features. One can see by his face that he was stabbed in the back, remarked Poirot. Very gently, he turned the dead man over. There, between the shoulder blades, staining the light fawn overcoat, was a round dark patch. In the middle of it there was a slit in the cloth. Poirot examined it narrowly. Have you any idea with what weapon the crime was committed? It was left in the wound. The commissary reached down a large glass jar. In it was a small object that looked to me more than like a paper knife than anything else. It had a black handle and a narrow, shining blade. The whole thing was not more than 10 inches long. Poirot tested the discolored point gingerly with his fingertip. Ma foi, but it is sharp. A nice, easy little tool for murder. Unfortunately, we could find no trace of fingerprint on it, remarked Bex regretfully. The murderer must have worn gloves. Of course he did, said Poirot contemptuously. Even in Santiago, they know enough for that. The veriest amateur of an English mace knows it, thanks to the publicity. The Bertillon system has been given in the press. All the same, It interests me very much that there were no fingerprints. It is so amazingly simple to leave the fingerprints of someone else, and then the police are happy. He shook his head. I very much fear our criminal is not a man of method. Either that or he was pressed for time. But we shall see. He let the body fall back into its original position. He wore only underclothes under his overcoat. I see, he remarked. Yes, the examining magistrate thinks that is rather a curious point. At this minute, there was a tap on the door, which Bex had closed after him. He strode forward and opened it. Francois was there. She endeavored to peep in with ghoulish curiosity. Well, what is it? Demanded Bex impatiently. Madame, she sent a message that she is much recovered and is quite ready to receive the examining magistrate. Good, said Bex briskly. Tell Monsieur Hortet and say that we will come at once. Poirot lingered a moment, looking back toward the body. I thought for a moment that he was going to apostrophize it, to declare aloud his determination never to rest till he had discovered the murder. But when he spoke, it was tamely and awkwardly, and his comment was ludicrously inappropriate to the solemnity of the moment. He wore his overcoat very long, he said constrainedly. Chapter 5. Mrs. Reynolds' Story. We found M. Hortet awaiting us in the hall, and we all proceeded upstairs together, Francois marching ahead to show us the way. Poirot went up in a sing-sang fashion, which puzzled me until he whispered with a grimace. No wonder the servants heard M. Ronald mounting the stairs. Not a board of them, but creaks fit to awake the dead. At the head of the staircase, a small passage branched off. The servants' quarters, explained Bex. We continued along a corridor, and Francois tapped on the last door to the right of it. A faint voice bade us enter, and we passed into a large sunny apartment looking out towards the sea, which showed blue and sparkling about a quarter of a mile distant. On a couch, propped up with cushions and attended by Dr. Durant, lay a tall, striking-looking woman. She was middle-aged, and her once dark hair was now almost entirely silvered, but the intense vitality and strength of her personality would have made itself felt anywhere. You know at once that you were in the presence of what the French call amie, mistress, famille. She greeted us with a dignified inclination of the head. Pray be seated, messieurs. We took chairs, and the magistrate's clerk established himself at a round table. I hope, Madame, began M. Hortet, what it will not distress you unduly to relate to us what occurred last night. Not at all, Monsieur. I know the value of time. If these scoundrelly assassins are to be caught and punished. Very well, Madame. It will fatigue you less, I think, if I ask you questions and you confine yourself to answering them. At what time did you go to bed last night? At 9:30, Monsieur. I was tired. And your husband? About an hour later, I fancy. Did he seem disturbed, upset in any way? No, not more than usual. What happened then? We slept. I was awakened by a hand pressed over my mouth. I tried to scream out, but the hand prevented me. There were two men in the room. They were both masked. Can you describe them at all, Madame? One was very tall and had a long black beard. The other was short and stout. His beard was reddish. They both wore hats pulled down over their eyes. Said the magistrate thoughtfully. Too much beard, I fear. You mean they were false? Yes, Madame. But continue your story. It was the short man who was holding me. He forced a gag into my mouth and then bound me with a rope, hand and foot. The other man was standing over my husband. He had caught up my little dagger paper knife from the dressing table and was holding it with the point just over his heart. Then the short man had finished with me. He joined the other, and they forced my husband to get up and accompany them into the dressing room next door. I was nearly fainting with terror. Nevertheless, I listened desperately. They were speaking in too low a tone for me to hear what they said, but I recognized the language, a bastard Spanish such as is spoken in some part of South America. They seemed to be demanding something from my husband, and presently they grew angry and their voices rose a little. I think the tall man was speaking. You know what we want, he said. The secret. Where is it? I do not know, what my husband answered, but the other replied fiercely. You lie. We know you have it. Where are your keys? Then I heard a sound of drawers being pulled out. There is a safe on the wall of my husband's dressing room, in which he always keeps a fairly large amount of ready money. Leonie tells me this has been rifled and the money taken, but evidently what they were looking for was not there, for presently I heard the tall man with an oath command my husband to dress himself. Soon after that, I think some noise in the house must have disturbed them, for they hustled my husband out into my room only half dressed. Pardon, interrupted Poirot. But is there then no other egress from the dressing room? No, monsieur, there is only the communicating door into my room. They hurried my husband through. The short man is front and the tall man behind him, with the dagger still in his hand. Paul tried to break away to come to me. I saw his agonized eyes. He turned to his captors. I must speak to her, he said, then coming to the side of the bed. It is all right, Eloise, he said. Don't be afraid. I shall return before morning. But although he tried to make his voice confident, I could see the terror in his eyes. Then they hustled him out of the door, the tall man saying, one sound, and you are a dead man, remember. After that, continued Mrs. Renault, I must have fainted. The next thing I recollect is Leonie rubbing my wrists and giving me brandy. Madame Renault, said the magistrate, had you any idea what it was for which the assassins were searching? None. Whatever, monsieur. Had you any knowledge that your husband feared something? Yes, I had seen the change in him. How long ago was that? Mrs. Renault reflected. 10 days, perhaps. Not longer? Possibly. I only noticed it then. Did you question your husband at all as to the cause? Once. He put me off evasively. Nevertheless, I was convinced that he was suffering some terrible anxiety. However, since he evidently wished to conceal the fact from me, I tried to pretend that I had noticed nothing. Were you aware that he had called in the services of a detective? A detective? Exclaimed Mrs. Ronald, very much surprised. Yes, this gentleman, Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Poirot bowed. He arrived today in response to a summons from your husband, and taking the letter written by M. Ronald from his pocket, he handed it to the lady. She read it with apparently genuine astonishment. I had no idea of this. Evidently, he was fully recognized of the danger. Now, Madame, I will beg of you to be frank with me. Is there any incident in your husband's past life in South America which might throw light on his murder? Mrs. Renault reflected deeply, but at last shook her head. I can think of none. Certainly, my husband had many enemies, people he had got the better of in some way or another, but I can think of no one distinctive case. I do not say there is no such incident, only that I am not aware of it. The examining magistrate stroked his beard disconsolately. And you can fix the time of this outrage? Yes, I distinctly remember hearing the clock on the mantelpiece strike 2. She nodded toward an 8-day traveling clock in a leather case which stood in the center of the chimney piece. Poirot rose from the seat, scrutinized the clock carefully and nodded satisfied. And here too, exclaimed Mbex, is a wristwatch knocked off the dressing table by the assassins without doubt and smashed to atoms. Little did they know it would testify against them. Gently he picked away the fragments of broken glass. Suddenly his face changed to one of utter stupefaction. Mon Dieu, he ejaculated. What is it? The hands of the watch point to 7 o'clock. What? Cried the examining magistrate, astonished. But Poirot felt as ever, took the broken trinket from the startled commissary and held it to his ear. Then he smiled. The glass is broken, yes, but the watch itself is still going. The explanation of the mystery was greeted with a relieved smile, but the magistrate bethought him of another point. But surely it is not 7 o'clock now. No, said Poirot gently. It is a few minutes after 5. Possibly the watch gains. Is that so, Madame? Mrs. Renault was frowning. It does gain, she admitted. But I have never known it gain quite so much as that. With a gesture of impatience, the magistrate left the matter of the watch and proceeded with his interrogatory. Madame, the front door was found ajar. It seems almost certain that the murderers entered that way, yet it has not been forced at all. Can you suggest any explanation? Possibly my husband went out for a stroll, the last thing, and forgot to latch it when he came in. Is that a likely thing to happen? Very. My husband was the most absent-minded of men. There was a slight frown on her brow as she spoke, as though this trait in the dead man's character had at times vexed her. There is one inference, I think, we might draw, remarked the commissary suddenly. Since the man insisted on Monsieur Renault dressing himself, it looks as though the place they were taking him to, The place where the secret was concealed lay some distance away. The magistrate nodded. Yes, far. And yet not too far, since he spoke of being back by morning. What time does the last train leave the station of Merlinville? Asked Poirot. 11:50 one way and 12:17 the other, but it is more probable that they had a motor waiting. Of course, agreed Poirot, looking somewhat crestfallen. Indeed, that might be one way of tracing them, continued the magistrate, brightening. A motor containing 2 foreigners is quite likely to have been noticed. That is an excellent point, Monsieur Bex. He smiled to himself and then, becoming grave once more, he said to Mrs. Renault, there is another question. Do you know anyone of the name of Duvian? Duvian, Mrs. Renault repeated thoughtfully. No, for the moment. I cannot say. I do. You have never heard your husband mention anyone of that name? Never. Do you know anyone whose Christian name is Bella? He watched Mrs. Renault narrowly as he spoke, seeking to surprisingly sign of anger or consciousness, but she merely shook her head in quite a natural manner. He continued his question. Are you aware that your husband had a visitor last night? Now he saw the red mount slightly in her cheeks, but she replied composedly, no. Who was that? A lady, indeed. But for the moment the magistrate was content to say no more. It seemed unlikely that Madame d'Aubrigal had any connection with the crime, and he was anxious not to upset Mrs. Renault more than necessary. He made a sign to the commissary, and the latter replied with a nod. Then rising, he went across the room and returned with the glass jar we had seen in the outhouse in his hand. From this he took the dagger. Madame, he said gently, do you recognize this? She gave a little cry. Yes, that is my little dagger. Then she saw the stained point, and she drew back, her eyes widening with horror. Is that blood? Yes, Madame. Your husband was killed with this weapon. He removed it hastily from sight. You are quite sure about its being the one that was on your dressing table last night? Oh yes, it was a present from my son. He was in the Air Force during the war. He gave his age as older than it was. There was a touch of the proud mother in her voice. This was made from streamlined aeroplane wire and was given to me by my son as a souvenir of the war. I see, Madame. That brings us to another matter. Your son, where is he now? It is necessary that he should be telegraphed to without delay. Jack, he is on his way to Buenos Aires. Yes, my husband telegraphed him yesterday. He had sent him on business to Paris, but yesterday he discovered that it would be necessary for him to proceed without delay to South America. There was a boat leaving Cherbourg for Buenos Aires last night, and he worried him to catch it. Have you any knowledge of what the business in Buenos Aires was? No, Monsieur. I know nothing of its nature, but Buenos Aires is not my son's final destination. He was going overland from there to Santiago. And in unison, the magistrate and the commissary exclaimed, Santiago, again Santiago. It was at this moment, when we were all stunned by the mention of that word, that Poirot approached Mrs. Renault. He had been standing by the window like a man lost in a dream, and I doubt if he had fully taken in what had passed. He paused by the lady's side with a bow. "Pardon, madame, but may I examine your wrists?" Though slightly surprised at the request, Mrs. Renault held them out to him. Round each of them was a cruel red mark. There the cords had bitten into the flesh. As he examined them, I fancied that a momentary flicker of excitement I had seen in his eyes disappeared. "They must cause you great pain," he said, and once more he looked puzzled. But the magistrate was speaking excitedly. "Young Monsieur Renault must be communicated with at once by wireless. It is vital that we should know anything he can tell us about this trip to Santiago." He hesitated. "I hoped he might have been near at hand, so that we could have saved you pain, madame." He paused. "You mean," she said in a low voice, "the identification of my husband's body?" The magistrate bowed his head. "I am a strong woman, monsieur. I can hear all that is required of me. I am ready now." "Oh, tomorrow will be quite soon enough, I assure you. I prefer to get it over," she said in a low tone, a spasm of pain crossing her face. "If you will be so good as to give me your arm, doctor." The doctor hastened forward. A cloak was thrown over Mrs. Renault's shoulders, and a slow procession went down the stairs. Mbax hurried on ahead to open the door of the shed. In a minute or two, Mrs. Renault appeared in the doorway. She was very pale, but resolute. She raised her hand to her face. "A moment, messieurs, while I steel myself." She took her hand away and looked down at the dead man. Then the marvelous self-control which had upheld her far deserted her. "Paul," she cried. "Husband, oh God!" And pitching forward, she fell unconscious to the ground. Instantly, Poirot was beside her. He raised the lid of her eyes, felt her pulse. When he had satisfied himself that she had really fainted, he drew aside. He caught me by the arm. "I am an imbecile, my friend, if ever there was love and grief in a woman's voice. I heard it then. My little idea was all wrong. Bien. I must start again." Chapter 6. The scene of the crime. Between them, the doctor and M. Hottech carried the unconscious woman into the house. The commissary looked after them, shaking his head. "Poor Femi," he muttered to himself. "The shock was too much for her. Well, we can do nothing now. Monsieur Poirot, shall we visit the place where the crime was committed?" "If you please, Monsieur Bex." We passed through the house and out by the front door. Poirot had looked up at the staircase in passing and shook his head in a dissatisfied manner. "It is to me incredible that the servants heard nothing. The creaking of that staircase, with 3 people descending it, would awaken the dead. It was the middle of the night, remember. They were sound asleep by them." But Poirot continued to shake his head, as though not fully accepting the explanation. On the sweep of the drive he paused, looking up at the house. What moved then? In the first place, to try if the front door were open. It was a most unlikely thing that it should be. It was far more probable that they should at once try to force a window. But all the windows on the ground floor are barred with iron shutters, objected the commissary. Poirot pointed to a window on the first floor. That is the window of the bedroom we have just come from. Is it not? And see, there is a tree by which it would be the easiest thing in the world to mount, possibly admitting the other, but they could not have done so without leaving footprints in the flower bed. I saw the justice of his words. There were two large oval flower beds planted with scarlet geraniums, one each side of the steps leading up to the front door. The tree in question had its roots actually at the back of the bed itself, and it would have been impossible to reach it without steeping to the bed. You see, continued the commissary, owing to the dry weather, no prints would show on the drive or path, but on the soft mold of the flower bed. It would have been a very different affair. Poirot went close to the bed and studied it attentively. As Bex had said, the mold was perfectly smooth. There was not an identification on it anywhere. Poirot nodded, as though convinced, and we turned away, but he suddenly darted off and began examining the other flower bed. Monsieur Bex, he called, see here. Here are plenty of traces for you. The commissary joined him and smiled. My dear Monsieur Poirot, those are, without doubt, the footprints of the gardener's large hobnailed boots. In any case, it would have no importance, since this side we have no trees and consequently no means of gaining access to the upper story. True, said Poirot, eventually crestfallen. So you think these footprints are of no importance? Not the least in the world. Then, to my utter astonishment, Poirot pronounced these words. I do not agree with you. I have a little idea that these footprints are the most important things we have seen yet. Bex said nothing, merely shrugged his shoulders. He was far too courteous to utter his real opinion. Shall we proceed? He said instead. Certainly, I can investigate this matter of the footprint later, said Poirot cheerfully. Instead of following the drive down to the gate, Bex turned up a path that branched off at right angles. It led up a slight incline, round to the right of the house, and was bordered on either side by a kind of shrubbery. Suddenly it emerged into the little clearing from which one obtained a view of the sea. A seat had been placed here, and not far from it was a rather ramshackle shed. A few steps further on, a neat line of small bushes marked the boundary of the villa grounds. Bex pushed his way through these, and we found ourselves on a wide stretch of open downs. It looked round and saw something that filled me with astonishment. Why, this is a golf course, I cried. Bex nodded. The links are not completed yet, he explained. It is hoped to be able to open them some time next month. It was some of the men working on them who discovered the body early in this morning. I gave a gasp. A little to my left, where for the moment I had overlooked it, it was a long narrow pit, and by it, face downwards, was the body of a man. For a moment my heart gave a terrible leap, and I had a wild fancy that the tragedy had been duplicated. But the commissary dispelled by illusion, by moving forward with a sharp exclamation of annoyance. What have my police been about? They had strict order to allow no one near the place without proper credentials. The man on the ground turned his head over his shoulder. But I have proper credentials, he remarked, and rose slowly to his feet. My dear Monsieur Gerard, cried the commissary, I had no idea that you had arrived even. I, examining magistrate, has been awaiting you with the utmost impatience. As he spoke, I was scanning the newcomer with the newest curiosity. The famous detective from the Paris Surrey was familiar to me, my name. But I was extremely interested to see him in the flesh. He was very tall, perhaps about 30 years of age, with auburn hair and moustache, and a military carriage. There was a trace of arrogance in his manner, which showed that he was fully alive to his own importance. Bex introduced us, presenting Poirot as a colleague. A flicker of interest came into the detective's eye. I know you, my name, Monsieur Poirot, he said. You cut quite a figure in the old ways, didn't you? But methods are very different now. Crimes, though, are very much the same, remarked Poirot gently. I saw at once that Gerard was prepared to be hostile. He presented the other being associated with him and felt that if he came across any clue of importance, he would be more than likely to keep it to himself. The examining magistrate began Bex again, but Gerard interrupted rudely. A fig for the examining magistrate. The light is the important thing. For all practical purpose, it will be gone in another half hour or so. I know all about the case, and the people at the house will do very well until tomorrow. But if we were going to find a clue to the murderers, here is a spot we shall find it. Is it your police who have been trembling all over the place? I thought they knew better nowadays. Assuredly they do. The marks you complain of were made by the workmen who discovered the body. The other grunted disgustedly. I can see the tracks where the three of them came through the hedge, but they were cunning. You can just recognize the center foot mark as those of Monsieur Renault, but those on either side have been carefully obliterated. Not that there would really be much to see anyway on this hard ground, but they weren't taking any chances. The external sign, said Poirot. That is what you seek, eh? The other detective stared. Of course. A very faint smile came to Poirot's lips. He seemed about to speak, but checked himself. He bent down to where a spade was laying. That is what the grave was dug with, right enough, said Gerard. But you will get nothing from it. It was Reynolds' own spade, and the men who used it wore gloves. Here they are. The gesticulated with his foot to where two soil-stained gloves were lying, and they are Reynolds too, or at least his gardeners. I tell you, the men who carries out this crime were taking no chances. The man was stabbed with his own dagger and would have been buried with his own spade. They counted on leaving no traces, but I will beat them. There is always something, and I mean to find it. But Poirot was now apparently interested in something else. A short, discolored piece of lead piping which lay beside the spade. He touched it delicately with his finger. And does this, too, belonging to the murderer man? He asked, and thought I detected a subtle flavor of irony in the question. Gerard shrugged his shoulders to indicate that he neither knew nor cared. May have been lying around here for weeks. Anyway, it doesn't interest me. I, on the contrary, find it very interesting, said Poirot sweetly. I guessed that he was merely bent on annoying the Paris detective, and if so, he succeeded. The other turned away rudely, remarking that he had no time to waste, and bending down, he resumed his minute search to the ground. Meanwhile, Poirot, as though struck by a sudden idea, stepped back over the boundary and tried the door of the little shed. That is locked, said Gerard over his shoulder, but it is only a place where the gardener keeps his rubbish. The spade didn't come from there, but from the tool shed up by the house. Marvelous, murmured Embex ecstatically to me. He has been here but half an hour, and he already knows everything. What a man! Undoubtedly, Gerard is the greatest detective alive today. Although I disliked the detective heartily, I nevertheless was secretly impressed. Efficiency seemed to radiate from the man. I could not help feeling that, so far, Poirot had not greatly distinguished himself, and it vexed him. He seemed to be directing his attention to all sorts of silly, puerile points that had nothing to do with the case. Indeed, at this juncture, he suddenly asked, Monsieur Bex, tell me, I pray you, the meaning of this whitewashed line that extends all round the grave. Is it a device of the police? No, Monsieur Poirot. It is an affair of the golf course. It shows that there is here to be a bunker, as you call it. A bunker? Poirot turned to me. That is the irregular hole filled with sand and a bank at one side. Is it not? I concurred. Monsieur Renault, without doubt. He played the golf? Yes, he was a keen golfer. It is mainly owing to him and to his large subscriptions that his work is being carried forward. He even had a say in the designing of it. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Then he remarked, it was not a very good choice they made of a spot to bury the body. When the men began to dig up the ground, all would have been discovered. Exactly, cried Gerard triumphantly. And that proves that they were strangers to the place. It is an excellent piece of indirect evidence. Yes, said Poirot doubtfully. No one who knew would bury a body there unless they wanted it to be discovered, and that is clearly absurd, is it not? Gerard did not even trouble to reply. Yes, said Poirot in a somewhat dissatisfied voice. Yes, undoubtedly absurd. Chapter 7. The Mysterious Madame Dubriel. As we retraced our steps to the house, Ambex excused himself for leaving us, explaining that he must immediately acquaint the examining magistrate with the fact of Gerard's arrival. Gerard himself had been obviously delighted when Poirot declared that he had seen all he wanted. The last thing we observed as we left the spot was Gerard scrolling about on all fours with a thoroughness in his search that I could not but admire. Poirot guessed my thoughts, for as soon as we were alone, he remarked ironically, "At last you have seen the detective you admire, the human foxhound, is it not so, my friend?" "At any rate, he is doing something," I said with asperity. "If there is nothing to find, he will find it. Now you envion. I also have found something, a piece of lead piping." "Nonsense, Poirot. You know very well that is got nothing to do with it. I meant little things, traces that may lead us infallibly to the murderers. Mon ami, a clue of 2 feet long is every bit as valuable as one measuring 2 millimeters. But it is the romantic idea that all important clues must be infinitesimal. As to the piece of lead piping having nothing to do with the crime, you say that because Gerard told you so." "No." As I was about to interpose a question, "We will say no more. Leave Gerard to his search and me to my ideas. The case seems straightforward enough, and yet, mon ami, I am not satisfied. And do you know why? Because of the wristwatch. That is 2 hours past. Then there are several curious little points that do not seem to fit in. For instance, if the object of murder was revenge, why did they not stab Renaud in his sleep and have done with it?" "They wanted the secret," I reminded him. Poirot brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve with a dissatisfied air. "Well, where is the secret?" "Presumably some distance away, since they wish him to dress himself. Yet he is found murdered close at hand, almost within earshot of the house. Then again it is pure chance that a weapon such as the dagger should be lying about casually ready to hand." He paused, frowning, and then went on. "Why did the servants hear nothing? Were they drugged? Was there an accomplice? And did that accomplice see to it that the front door should remain open? I wonder if—" He stopped abruptly. We had reached the drive in front of the house. Suddenly he turned to me. "My friend, I am about to surprise you. To please you, I have taken your reproaches to heart. We will examine some footprints." "Where?" "In the right hand, but yonder. Monsieur Bex says that they are the footmark of the gardener. Let us see if this is so. See, he approaches with his wheelbarrow." Indeed, an elderly man was just crossing the drive with a barrowful of seedling. Poirot called to him, and he set down the barrow and came hobbling towards us. "You are going to ask him for one of his boots to compare with the footmarks?" I asked breathlessly. My faith in Poirot revived a little, since he said the footprints in this right hand but were important. "Presumably they were." "Exactly," said Poirot. "But won't he think it very odd?" "He will not think about it at all." We could say no more. For the old man had joined us. You want me for something, monsieur? Yes, you have been gardener here a long time, haven't you? 24 years, monsieur. And your name is Auguste, monsieur. I was admiring the significant geraniums. They are truly superb. They have been planted long. Some time, monsieur, but of course, to keep the beds looking smart, one must keep bedding out a few new plants and remove those that are over, besides keeping the old blooms well picked off. You put in some new plants yesterday, didn't you? Those in the middle there, and in the other bed also. Monsieur has a sharp eye. It takes always a day or so for them to pick up. Yes, I put 10 new plants in each bed last night. As monsieur doubtless knows, one should not put in plants when the sun is hot. Auguste was charmed with Poirot's interest and was quite inclined to be garrulous. That is a splendid specimen there, said Poirot, pointing. Might I perhaps have a cutting of it? But certainly, monsieur. The old fellow stepped into the bed and carefully took a slip from the plant Poirot had admired. Poirot was profuse in his thanks, and Auguste departed to his burrow. You see, said Poirot with a smile, as he bent over the bed to examine the indentation of the gardener's hobnailed boot. It is quite simple. I did not realize that the foot would be inside the boot. You do not use your excellent mental capacities sufficiently. Well, what of the footmark? I examined the bed carefully. All the footmarks in the bed were made by the same boot, I said at length after a careful study. You think so? Eh bien, I agree with you, said Poirot. He seemed quite uninterested, and as though he were thinking something else. At any rate, I remarked, you will have one bee less in your bonnet now. Mon Dieu, but what an idiom! What does it mean? What I meant was that now you will give up your interest in these footmarks. But to my surprise, Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami. At last I am on the right track. I am still in the dark. But as I hinted just now to Monsieur Bex, these footmarks are the most important and interesting things in the case. That poor Giraud. I should not be surprised if he took no notice of them whatever. At that moment, the front door opened, and M. Hotet and the commissary came down the steps. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, who were coming to look for you, said the magistrate. It is getting late, but I wish to pay a visit to Madame Dubergale. Without doubt, she will be very much upset by Monsieur Ranald's death, and we may be fortunate enough to get a clue from her. The secret that he did not confine to his wife. It is possible that he may have told it to the woman whose love held him enslaved. We know where our Samsons are weak, don't we? We said no more, but fell into line. Poirot walked with the examining magistrate and the commissary, and followed a few paces behind. There is no doubt that Francois' story is substantially correct, he remarked to me in a confidential tone. I have been telephoning headquarters. It seems that 3 times in the last 6 weeks, that is to say, since the arrival of Monsieur Renault at Merlinville, Madame Dubergale has paid a large sum in notes into her banking account. All together. The sum totaled 200,000 francs. Dear me, I said, considering. That must be something like 4,000 pounds. Precisely, yes. There can be no doubt that he was absolutely infatuated, but it remains to be seen whether he confided his secret to her. The examining magistrate is hopeful, but I hardly share his views. During this conversation, we were walking down the lane towards a fork in the road where our car had halted earlier in the afternoon, and in another moment I realized that the Villa Marguerite, the home of the mysterious Madame Dubergale, who was a small house from which the beautiful girl had emerged. She has lived here for many years, said the commissary, nodding his head towards the house. Very quickly, very unobtrusively, she seemed to have no friends or relatives other than the acquaintances she has made in Merlinville. She never refers to the past, nor to her husband. One does not even know if he is alive or dead. There is a mystery about her. You comprehend? I nodded, my interest growing. And the daughter, I ventured. A truly beautiful young girl, modest, devout, all that she should be. One pities her, for though she may know nothing of the past, a man who wants to ask her hand in marriage must necessarily inform himself, and then. The commissionary shrugged his shoulders cynically. But it would not be her fault, I cried with rising indignation. No, but what will you? A man is particularly about his wife's antecedents. I was prevented from further argument by our arrival at the door. M. Hortet rang the bell. A few minutes elapsed, and then we heard a footfall within, and the door was opened. On the threshold stood my young goddess of that afternoon. When she saw us, the color left her cheeks, leaving her deathly white, and her eyes widened with apprehension. There was no doubt about it. She was afraid. Mademoiselle Dubergale, said M. Hortet, sweeping off his hat. We regret infinitely to disturb you, but the exigencies of the law. You comprehend? My compliments to Madame, your mother, and will she have the goodness to greet me a few moments' interview? For a moment the girl stood motionless. Her left hand was pressed to her side, as though to still the sudden unconquerable agitation of her heart. But she mastered herself and said in a low voice, I will go and see. Please come inside. She entered the room on the left of the hall, and we heard the low murmur of her voice, and then another voice, much the same in timbre, but with a slightly harder inflection behind its mellow roundness, said, But certainly ask them to enter. In another minute, we were face to face with the mysterious Madame Dubergale. She was not nearly too tall as her daughter, and the rounded curves of her figure had all the grace of full maturity. Her hair, again unlike her daughter's, was dark and parted in the middle in the Madonna style. Her eyes, half hidden by the drooping lid, were blue. Though very well preserved, she was certainly no longer young, but her charm was of the quality which is dependent of age. You wished to see me, monsieur? She asked. Yes, madame. M. Hortet cleared his throat. I am investigating the death of Monsieur Renault. You have heard of it, no doubt. She bowed her head without speaking. Her expression did not change. We came to ask you whether you can throw any light upon the circumstances surrounding it. The surprise of her tone was excellent. Yes, madame. We have reason to believe that you were in the habit of visiting the dead man at his villa in the evenings. Is that so? The color rose in the lady's pale cheek, but she replied quietly, I deny your right to ask me such a question. Madame, we are investigating a murder. Well, what of it? I had nothing to do with the murder. Madame, we do not say that for a moment, but you know the dead man well. Did he ever confide in you as to any danger that threatened him? Never. Did he ever mention his life in Santiago and any enemies he may have made there? No. Then you can give us no help at all. I fear not. I really do not see why you should come to me. Cannot his wife tell you what you want to know? Her voice held a slender inflection of irony. Mrs. Renault had told us all the scan. Ah, said Madame Dubreuil. I wonder. You wonder what, madame? Nothing. The examining magistrate looked at her. He was aware that he was fighting a duel and that he had no mean antagonist. You persist in your statement that Monsieur Renault confided nothing to you? Why should you think it likely that he should confide in me? Because, madame, said M. Hortet with calculated brutality, a man tells his mistress what he does not always tell to his wife. Oh, she sprang forward. Her eyes flashed fire. Monsieur, you insult me, and before my daughter. I can tell you nothing. Have the goodness to leave my house. The honors undoubtedly rested with the lady. We left the villa, Marguerite, like a shamefaced pack of schoolboys. The magistrate muttered angry ejaculations to himself. Poirot seemed lost in thought. Suddenly he came out of his reverie with a start and inquired of M. Hortet if there was a good hotel near at hand. There was a small place, the Hotel des Bains, on the side of the town, a few hundred yards down the road. It will be handy for your investigations. We shall see you in the morning then, I presume. Yes, I thank you, Monsieur Hortet. With mutual civilities, we parted company, Poirot and I going towards Merlinville, and the others returning to the Ville Genevieve. The French police system is very marvelous, said Poirot, looking after them. The information they possess about everyone's life, down to the most commonplace detail, is extraordinary. Though he has only been here little over 6 weeks, they are perfectly well acquainted with Monsieur Renault's tastes and pursuits, and at a moment's notice they can produce information as to Madame Dubreuil's banking account and the sums that have lately been paid in. Undoubtedly, the dossier is a great institution. But what is that? He turned sharply. A figure was running hatless down the road after us. It was Marthe Dubreuil. I beg your pardon, she cried breathlessly as she reached us. I should not do this. I know you must not tell my mother, but it is true. what the people say, that Monsieur Renault called in a detective before he died, and that you are he. Yes, mademoiselle, said Poirot gently. It is quite true, but how did you learn it? Francois told our Emily, explained Marthe with a blush. Poirot made a grimace. The secretary, it is impossible in an affair of this kind. Not that it matters. Well, mademoiselle, what is it you want to know? The girl hesitated. She seemed longing, yet fearing to speak. At last, almost in a whisper, she asked, is anyone suspected? Poirot eyed her keenly. Then he replied evasively, suspicion is in the air at present. Yes, I know, but anyone in particular? Why do you want to know? The girl seemed frightened by the question. All at once Poirot's words about her earlier in the bay occurred to me. The girl with the anxious eyes. Monsieur Renault was always very kind to me, she replied at last. It is natural that I should be interested. I see, said Poirot. Well, suspicion at present is hovering round two persons. Two. I could have sworn there was a note of surprise and relief in her voice. Their names are unknown, but they are presumed to be Chileans from Santiago. And now, Mademoiselle, you see what comes of being young and beautiful. I have betrayed professional secrets for you. The girl laughed merrily, and then, rather shyly, she thanked him. I must run back now. Maman will miss me. And she turned and ran back up the road, looking like a modern Atlanta. I stared after her. Mon ami, said Poirot in his gentle, ironical voice, is it that we are to remain planted here all night just because you have seen a beautiful young woman and your head is in a whirl? I laughed and apologized. But she is beautiful, Poirot. Anyone might be excused for being bowled over her. But to my surprise, Poirot shook his head very earnestly. Ah, mon ami, do not set your heart on Marthe Dubergale. She is not for you, that one. Take it from Papa Poirot. Why, I cried. The commissary assured me that she was as good as she is beautiful. A perfect angel. Some of the greatest criminals I have known had the faces of angels, remarked Poirot cheerfully. A malformation of the grey cells may coincide quite easily with the face of a Madonna. Poirot, I cried, horrified. You cannot mean that. You suspect an innocent child like this. Ta ta ta. Do not excite yourself. I have not said that I suspected her. But you must admit that her anxiety to know about the case is somewhat unusual. For once I see further than you do, I said. Her anxiety is not for herself, but for her mother. My friend, said Poirot, as usual, you see nothing at all. Madame Dubergale is very well able to look after herself without her daughter worrying about her. I admit I was teasing you just now, but all the same, I repeat what I said before. Do not set your heart on that girl. She is not for you. I, Hercule Poirot, knows it. Sacre, if only I could remember where I had been that face. What face? I asked, surprised. The daughters? No, the mothers. Nothing may surprise. He nodded empathetically. But yes, it is as I tell you. It was a long time ago when I was still with the police in Belgium. I have never actually seen the woman before, but I have seen her picture and in connection with some case I rather fancy. Yes, I may be mistaken, but I rather fancy that it was a murder case. Chapter 8. An Unexpected Meeting. We were up to the villa betimes next morning. The man on guard at the gate did not bar our way this time. Instead, he respectfully saluted us, and we passed on to the house. The maid Leonie was just coming down the stairs and seemed not averse to the prospect of a little conversation. Poirot inquired after the health of Mrs. Renault. Leonie shook her head. She is terribly upset. The poor lady. She will eat nothing but nothing, and she is as pale as a ghost. It is heart-threatening to see her. Ah, it is not. I would grieve like that for a man who had deceived me with another woman. Poirot nodded sympathetically. What you say is very just, but what will you? The heart of a woman who loves will forgive many blows. Still, undoubtedly, there must have been many scenes of recrimination between them in the last few months. Again, Leonie shook her head. Never, monsieur, never have I heard Madame utter a word of protest, of reproach. Even she had the temper and disposition of an angel, quite different to Monsieur. Monsieur Renault had not the temper of an angel, far from it. When he enraged himself, the whole house knew of it. The day that he quarrelled with Monsieur Jacques, ma foi, they might have been heard in the marketplace. They shouted so loud. Indeed, said Poirot. And when did this quarrel take place? Oh, it was just before Monsieur Jacques went to Paris. Almost he missed him train. He came out of the library and caught up his bag, which he had left in the hall. The automobile, it was being repaired, and he had to run for the station. I was dusting the saloon, and I saw him pass, and his face was white with two burning spots of red. Oh, but he was angry. Leonie was enjoying her narrative thoroughly, and the dispute. What was it about? Oh, that I do not know, confessed Leonie. It is true that they shouted, but their voices were so loud and high, and they spoke so fast, that only one well acquainted with English could have comprehended. But Monsieur, he was like a thundercloud all day, impossible to please him. The sound of a door shutting upstairs cut short Leonie's loquacity. And Francois, who awaits me, she exclaimed, awaiting to a steady remembrance of her duties. That old one, she always scolds. One moment, Mademoiselle. The examining magistrate, where is he? They have gone out to look at the automobile in the garage. Monsieur, the commissary had some idea that it might have been used on the night of the murder. Quelle idée, murmured Poirot as the girl disappeared. You will go out and join them. No, I shall await their return in the saloon. It is cool there on this hot morning. This placid way of taking things did not quite commend itself to me. If you don't mind, I said and hesitated. Not in the least. You wish to investigate on your own account, eh? Well, I would rather like to have a look at Gerard, if he is anywhere about, and see what he is up to. The human foxhound, murmured Poirot as he leaned back in a comfortable chair and closed his eyes. By all means, my friend. Oh, Revoyer. I scrolled out of the front door. It was certainly hot. I turned up the path we had taken the day before. I had a mind to study the scene of the crime myself. I did not go directly to the spot, however, but turned aside into the bushes so as to come out on the links some 100 yards or so further to the right. The shrubbery here was much denser and had quite a struggle to force my way through. When I emerged at last on the course, it was quite unexpectedly and with such vigor that I cannoned heavily into the young lady who had been standing with her back to the plantation. She not unnaturally gave a suppressed shriek, but I too uttered an exclamation of surprise, for it was my friend of the train, Cinderella. The surprise was mutual. We both exclaimed simultaneously. The young lady recovered herself first. My only aunt, she exclaimed, what are you doing here? For the matter of that, what are you? I retorted. When last I saw you, the day before yesterday, you were trotting home to England like a good little boy. When last I saw you, I said, you were trotting home with your sister like a good little girl. By the way, how is your sister? A flash of white teeth rewarded me. How kind of you to ask. My sister is well, I thank you. She is here with you. She reminded to town, said the minx with dignity. I don't believe you have got a sister. I laughed. If you have, her name is Harris. Do you remember mine? She asked with a smile. Cinderella. But you are going to tell me the real one. Now aren't you? She shook her head with a wicked look. Not even why you are here. Oh, that. I suppose you have heard of member of my profession resting at expensive French watering places. Dirt cheap if you know where to go. I eyed her keenly. Still, you would no intention of coming here when I met you 2 days ago. We all have our disappointments, said Miss Cinderella sententiously. There now. I have told you quite as much as is good for you. Little boys should not be inquisitive. You have not yet told me what you are doing here. You remember my telling you that my great friend was a detective. Yes, and perhaps you have heard about this crime at the Villa Genevieve. She stared at me. Her breast heaved and her eyes grew wide and round. You don't mean that you are in on that? I nodded. There was no doubt that I had scored heavily. Her emotion, as she regarded me, was only too evident. For some few seconds she remained silent, staring at me. Then she nodded her head emphatically. Well, if that doesn't beat the band, taught me round. I want to see all the horrors. What do you mean? What I say? Bless the boy, didn't I tell you I doted on crimes? I have been nosing round for hours. It is a real piece of luck happening on you this way. Come on. show me all the sights. But look here, wait a minute, I can't. Nobody's allowed in. They are awfully strict. Aren't you and your friends the big bugs? I was loath to relinquish my position of importance. Why are you so keen? I asked weakly. And what is it you want to see? Oh, everything. The place where it happened, and the weapon, and the body, and any fingerprints or interesting things like that. I have never had a chance before of being right in on a murder like this. It will last me all my life. I turned away, sickened. What were women coming to nowadays? The girl's ghoulish excitement nauseated me. Come off your high horse, said the lady suddenly, and doesn't give yourself airs. When you got called to this job, did you put your nose in the air and say it was a nasty business and you wouldn't be mixed up in it? No, but if you would been here on a holiday, wouldn't you be nosing round just the same as I am? Of course you would. I am a man, you are a woman. Your idea of a woman is someone who gets on a chair and strikes if she seems a mouse. That is all prehistoric, but you will show me round. Won't you? You see, it might have a big difference to me. In what way? They are keeping all the reporters out. I might make a big scoop with one of the papers. You don't know how much they pay for a bit of inside stuff. I hesitated. She slipped a small, soft hand into mine. Please, there is a dear. I capitulated secretly. I know that. I should rather enjoy the part of showman. We repaired first to the spot where the body had been discovered. A man was on guard there, who saluted respectfully, knowing me by sight, and raised no question as to my companion. Presumably, he regarded her as watched for by me. I explained to Cinderella just how the discovery had been made, and she listened attentively, sometimes putting an intelligent question. Then we turned our step into the direction of the villa. I proceeded rather cautiously, for, truth to tell, I was not at all anxious to meet anyone. I took the girl through the strawberry round to the back of the house, where the small shed was. I recollected that yesterday evening, after relocking the door, Bex had left the key with the Sergeant de Ville Marchot, in case Monsieur Gerard should require it while we are upstairs. I thought it quite likely that the Surrey detective, after using it, had returned to Marchot again, leaving the girl out of sight in the strawberry. I entered the house. Marchot was on duty outside the door of the salon. From within came the murmur of voices. Monsieur desires Monsieur Hottest. He is within. He is again interrogating Francois. No, I said hastily. I don't want him, but I should very much like the key of the shed with outside if it is not against regulations. But certainly, Monsieur, he produced it. Here it is. Monsieur Hotet gave orders that all facilities were to be placed at your disposal. You will return it to me when you have finished out there. That is all. Of course, I felt a thrill of satisfaction as I realized that in Marchot's eyes, at least, I ranked equally in importance with Poirot. The girl was waiting for me. She gave an exclamation of delight as she saw the key in my hand. You have got it then? Of course, I said coolly. All the same, you know, what I am doing is highly irregular. You have been a perfect duck, and I shan't forget it. Come along. They can't see us from the house, can they? Wait a minute. I arrested her eager advance. I won't stop you if you really wish to go in. But do you? You have seen the grave and the grounds, and you have heard all the details of the affair. Isn't that enough for you? This is going to be gruesome, you know, and unpleasant. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I could not quite fathom. Then she laughed. Me for the horrors, she said. Come along. In silence, we arrived at the door of the shed. I opened it and was passed in. I walked over to the body and gently pulled down the sheet as Bex had done the preceding afternoon. A little gasping sound escaped from the girl's lip, and turned and looked at her. There was horror on her face now, and those debonair high spirit of hers were quenched utterly. She had not chosen to listen to my advice, and she was punished now for her disregard of it. I felt singularly merciless towards her. She should go through with it now. I turned the corpse over gently. You see, I said, he was stabbed in the back. Her voice was almost soundless. With what? I nodded towards the glass jar. That dagger. Suddenly the girl reeled and then sank down in a heap. I sprang to her assistance. You are faint. Come out of here. It has been too much for you. Water, she murmured. Quick water. I left her and rushed into the house. Fortunately, none of the servants were about, and I was able to secure a glass of water unobserved and add a few drops of brandy from a pocket flask. In a few minutes, I was back again. The girl was lying as I had left her, but a few sips of the brandy and water revived her in a marvelous manner. Take me out of here. Oh, quickly, quickly, she cried, shuddering. Supporting her with my arm, I led her out into the air, and she pulled the door to behind her. Then she drew a deep breath. That is better. Oh, it was horrible. Why did you ever let me go in? I felt this to be so feminine that I could not forbear a smile. Secretly, I was not dissatisfied with her collapse. It proved that she was not quite so callous as I had thought her. After all, she was little more than a child, and her curiosity had probably been of the unthinking order. I did my best to stop you, you know, I said gently. I suppose you did. Well, goodbye. Look here, you can't start off like that, all alone. You are not fit for it. I insist on accompanying you back to Merlinville. Nonsense, I am quite all right now. Supposing you felt faint again? No, I shall come with you. But this she combated with a good deal of energy. In the end, however, I prevailed so far as to be allowed to accompany her to the outskirts of the town. We retraced our steps over our former route, passing the grave again and making a detour onto the road where the first straggling line of shops began. She stopped and held out her hand. Goodbye, and thank you ever so much for coming with me. Are you sure you are all right now? Quite thanks. I hope you don't get into any trouble over showing me things. I disclaimed the idea lightly. Well, goodbye. Au revoir, I corrected. If you are staying here, we shall meet again. She flashed a smile at me. That is so. Au revoir then. Wait a second, you haven't told me your address. Oh, I am staying at the Hotel du Fair. It is a little place, but quite good. Come and look me up tomorrow. I will, I said with perhaps rather unnecessary empressement. I watched her out of sight, then turned and retraced my steps into the villa. I remembered that I had not relocked the door of the shed. Fortunately, no one had noticed the oversight, and turning the key, I removed it and returned into the Sergeant de Ville. And as I did so, it came upon me suddenly that though Cinderella had given me her address, I still not know her name. Chapter 9. M. Gerard finds some clues. In the salon, I found the examining magistrate busily interrogating the old gardener, Auguste, Poirot, and the commissary, who were both present, greeted me respectively with a smile and a polite bow. I slipped quietly into the seat. M. Hortet was painstaking and meticulous in the extreme, but did not succeed in eliciting anything of importance. The gardening gloves Auguste admitted to be his. He wore them when handling a certain species of primula plant, which was poisonous to some people. He could not say when he had worn them last. Certainly he had not missed them. Were they kept, sometimes in one place, sometimes in another. The spade was usually to be found in the small tool shed. Was it locked? Of course, it was locked. Where was the key kept? Parbleu. It was in the door, of course. There was nothing of the value to steal. Who would have expected a party of bandits or assassins? Such things did not happen in Madame la Vicomte's time. M. Hortet, signifying that he had finished with him, the old man withdrew, grumbling to the last, remembering Poirot's unaccountable insistence on the footprints in the flower beds. I scrutinized him narrowly as he gave his evidence. Either he had nothing to do with the crime, or he was a consummate actor. Suddenly, just as he was going out of the door, an idea struck me. Pardon, Monsieur Hortet, I cried, but will you permit me to ask him one question? But certainly, Monsieur. Thus encouraged, I turned to Auguste. Where do you keep your boots? On my feet, growled the old man. Where else? But when you go to bed at night? Under my bed. But who cleans them? Nobody. Why should they be cleaned? As it that I promenade myself on the front like a young man? On Sunday I wear the Sunday boots, but otherwise. He shrugged his shoulders. I shook my head, discouraged. Well, well, said the magistrate, we do not advance very much. Undoubtedly, we are held up until we get the return cable from Santiago. Has anyone seen Gerard? In variety, that one lacks politeness. I have a very good mind to send for him, and you will not have to send far. The quiet voice startled us. Gerard was standing outside looking in through the open window. He leaped slightly into the room and advanced to the table. Here I am, at your service. Accept my excuses for not presenting myself sooner. Not at all, said the magistrate, rather confused. Of course, I am only a detective, continued the other. I knew nothing of interrogatories. Were I conducting one, I should be inclined to do so without an open window. Anyone standing outside can so easily hear all that passes. But no matter. Hortet flushed angrily. There was evidently going to be no love lost between the examining magistrate and the detective in charge of the case. They had fallen foul of each other at the start. Perhaps in any event, it would have been much the same. To Gerard, all examining magistrates were fools, and to Hortet, who took himself seriously, the casual manner of the Paris detective could not fail to give offense. Bien, Monsieur Gerard, said the magistrate rather sharply. Without doubt, you have been employing your time to the marvel. You have the names of the assassins for us, have you not? And also the precise spot where they find themselves now? I unremoved by this irony, Gerard replied. I know at last where they have come from. Gerard took two small objects from his pocket and laid them down on the table. We crowded round. The objects were very simple ones, the stub of a cigarette and an unlighted match. The detective wheeled round on Poirot. What do you see there? He asked. There was something almost brutal in his tone. It made my cheeks flush, but Poirot remained unmoved. He shrugged his shoulders. A cigarette and a match. And what does that tell you? Poirot spread out his hands. It tells me nothing. Oh, said Gerard in a satisfied voice. You haven't made a study of these things. That is not an ordinary match, not in this country at least. It is common enough in South America. Luckily, it is unlighted. I mightn't have recognized it otherwise. Evidently, one of the men threw away his cigarette and lit another, spilling one match out of the box as he did so. And the other match? Asked Poirot. Which match? The one he did light his cigarette with. You have found that also? No, perhaps you didn't search very thoroughly. Not search thoroughly. For a moment it seemed as though the detective was going to break out angrily, but with an effort he controlled himself. I see you love a joke, Monsieur Poirot, but in any case, match or no match, the cigarette end would be sufficient. It is a South American cigarette with licorice pectoral paper. Poirot bowed. The commissary spoke. The cigarette and match might have belonged to Monsieur Renault. Remember, it is only 2 years since he returned from South America. No, replied the other confidently. I have already searched among the effects of Monsieur Renault. The cigarettes he smoked and the matches he used are quite different. You do not think it odd, asked Poirot, that these strangers should come unprovided with a weapon, with gloves, with a spade, and that they should so conveniently find all these things? Gerard smiled in a rather superior manner. Undoubtedly, it is strange, indeed. Without the theory that I hold, it would be inexplicable. Ah, said Hortet. An accomplice within the house or outside it, said Gerard with a peculiar smile. But someone must have admitted them. We cannot allow that any unparalleled piece of good fortune. They found the door ajar. for them to walk in. The door was opened for them, but it could just as easily be opened from outside by someone who possessed a key. But who did possess a key? Gerard shrugged his shoulders. As for that, no one who possesses one is going to admit the fact if he can help it. But several people might have had one. Monsieur Jacques Renault, the son, for instance. It is true that he is on his way to South America, but he might have lost the key or had it stolen from him. Then there is the gardener. He has been here many years. One of the younger servants may have a lover. It is easy to take an impression of a key and have one cut. There are many possibilities. Then there is another person who, I should judge, is exceedingly likely to have such a thing. Who is that? Madame de Briolle, said the detective. Eh? Said the magistrate. So you have heard about that, have you? I hear everything, said Gerard imperturbably. There is one thing I could swear you have not heard, said Amhotet, delighted to be able to show superior knowledge, and without more ado he detailed the story of the mysterious visitor the night before. He also touched on the check made out of Duvian, and finally handed Gerard the letter signed Bella. All very interesting, but my theory remained unaffected. And your theory is? For the moment I prefer not to say. Remember, I am only just beginning my investigations. Tell me one thing, Monsieur Gerard, said Poirot suddenly. Your theory always for the door being opened. It does not explain why it was left open when they departed. Would it not have been natural for them to close it behind them if a Sergeant de Ville had chanced to come up to the house, as is sometimes done, to see that all is well? They might have been discovered and overtaken almost at once. Bah, they forgot it. A mistake, I grant you. Then, to my surprise, Poirot uttered almost the same word as he had uttered to Bugs the previous evening. I do not agree with you. The door being left open was the result of either design or necessity, and any theory that does not admit that fact is bound to prove vain. We all regarded the little man with a good deal of astonishment. The confession of ignorance drawn from him over the match, and had, I thought, been bound to humiliate him. But here he was, self-satisfied as ever, laying down the law to Gerard without a tremor. The detective twisted his moustache, eyeing his friend in a somewhat bantering fashion. You don't agree with me, eh? Well, what strikes you particularly about the case? Let us hear your views. One thing presents itself to me as being significant. Tell me, Monsieur Gerard, does nothing strike you as familiar about this case? Is there anything it reminded you of? Familiar. Reminds me of. I can't say offhand. I don't think so, though. You are wrong, said Poirot quietly. A crime almost precisely similar has been committed before. When and where? Ah, that unfortunately I cannot be for the moment remember, but I shall do so. I had hoped you might be able to assist me. Gerard snorted incredulously. There have been many affairs of masked men. I cannot remember the details of them all. The crimes all resemble each other, more or less. There is such a thing as the individual touch. Poirot suddenly assumed his lecturing manner and addressed us collectively. I am speaking to you now, of the psychology of crime. Monsieur Gerard knows quite well that each criminal has his particular method and that the police, when called in to investigate, say, a case of burglary, can often make a shrewd guess at the offender simply by the peculiar methods he has employed. Jup would tell you the same. Hastings. Man is an unoriginal animal. Unoriginal within the law in his daily respectable life. Equally unoriginal outside the law. If a man commits a crime, any other crime he commits will resemble it closely. The English murderer who disposed of his wives in succession by drowning them in their baths was a case in point. Had he varied his methods, he might have escaped detection to the day. But he obeyed the common dictates of human nature, arguing that what had once succeeded would succeed again, and he paid the penalty of his lack of originality. And the point of all this, sneered Gerard, that when you have two crimes precisely similar in design and execution, you find the same brain behind them both. I am looking for that brain, Monsieur Gerard, and I shall find it. Here we have a true clue, a psychological clue. You may know all about cigarettes and match ends, Monsieur Gerard, but I, Hercule Poirot, know the mind of men. Gerard remained singularly unimpressed. For your guidance, continued Poirot, I will also advise you of one fact which might fail to be brought to your notice. The wristwatch of Madame Renault on the day following the tragedy had gained 2 hours. Gerard stared. Perhaps it was in the habit of gaining. As a matter of fact, I am told it did. Very well, then. All the same, 2 hours is a good deal, said Poirot softly. Then there is a matter of the footprints in the flower bed. He nodded his head towards the open window. Gerard took 2 eager strides and looked out. But I see no footprints. No, said Poirot, straightening a little pile of books on a table. There are none. For a moment an almost murderous rage obscured Gerard's face. He took 2 strides towards his tormentor, but at that moment the salon door was opened and Mershot announced, Monsieur Stoner, the secretary, has just arrived from England. May he enter? Chapter 10. Gabriel Stoner. The man who now entered the room was a striking figure, very tall, with a well-knit, athletic frame, and a deeply bronzed face and neck. He dominated the assembly. Even Gerard seemed anemic beside him. When I knew him better, I recognized that Gabriel Stoner was quite an unusual personality. English by birth, he had knocked about all over the world. He had shot big game in Africa, travelled in Korea, ranged in California, and traded in the South Sea Islands. His unerring eye picked out M. The examining magistrate in charge of the case. Pleased to meet you, sir. This is a terrible business. How is Mrs. Renault? Is she bearing up fairly well? It must have been an awful shock to her. Terrible, terrible, said M. Permit me to introduce Monsieur Bex, our commissary of police, Monsieur Gerard of the Surete. This gentleman is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Mr. Renault sent for him, but he arrived too late to do anything to avert the tragedy. A friend of Monsieur Poirot's, Captain Hastings. Stoner looked at Poirot with some interest. Sent for you, did he? You did not know, then, that Monsieur Renault contemplated calling a detective? Interposed M. Bucks. No, I didn't, but it doesn't surprise me a bit. Why? Because the old man was rattled. I don't know what it was all about. He didn't confide in me. We weren't on those terms, but rattled he was, and badly. Said M. Hortet. But you have no notion of the cause? That is what I said, sir. You will pardon me, Monsieur Stoner, but we must begin with a few formalities. Your name? Gabriel Stoner. How long ago was it that you became secretary to Monsieur Renault? About 2 years ago, when he first arrived from South America. I met him through a mutual friend, and he offered me the post. A thundering good boss he was too. Did he talk to you much about his life in South America? Yes, a good bit. Do you know if he was ever in Santiago? Several times, I believe. He never mentioned any special incident that occurred there, anything that might have provoked some vendetta against him? Never. Did he speak of any secret that he had acquired while sojourning there? Not that I can remember, but for all that, there was a mystery about him. I have never heard him speak of his boyhood, for instance, or of any incident prior to his arrival in South America. He was a French Canadian by birth, I believe, but I have never heard him speak of his life in Canada. He could shut up like a calm if he liked. So, as far as you know, he had no enemies, and you can give us no clue as to any secret to obtain possession of which he might have been murdered. That is so, Monsieur Stoner. Have you ever heard the name of Duveen in connection with Monsieur Renault? Duveen. He tried the name over thoughtfully. I don't think I have, and yet it seems familiar. Do you know a lady, a friend of Monsieur Renault's, whose Christian name is Bella? Again Mr. Stoner shook his head. Bella Duveen. Is that the full name? It is curious, I am sure, I know it, but for the moment I can't remember in what connection. The magistrate coughed. He understands, Monsieur Stoner. The case is like this. There must be no reservation. You might, perhaps, through a feeling of consideration for Madame Renault, for whom I gather you have a great esteem and affection. You might, in fact, said M. Hortet, getting rather tied up in his sentence. There must absolutely be no reservation. Stoner stared at him, a drawing light of comprehension in his eyes. I don't quite get you, he said gently. Where does Mrs. Renault came in? I have an immense respect and affection for that lady. She is a very wonderful and unusual type, but I don't quite see how my reservations or otherwise could affect her. Not if this Bella Duveen should prove to have been something more than a friend to her husband. Oh, said Stoner, I get you know, but I will bet my bottom dollar that you are wrong. The old man never so much as looked at a petticoat. He just adored his own wife. They were the most devoted couple I know. M. Hortet shook his head gently. Monsieur Stoner, he hold absolute proof. I love a love letter written by this Bella to Monsieur Renault, accusing him of having tired of her. Moreover, we have further proof that at the time of his death, he was carrying on an intrigue with a French woman, a Madame Dubriol, who runs the adjoining villa. The secretary's eyes narrowed. Hold on, sir. You are barking up the wrong tree. I knew Paul Renault. What you have just been saying is plumb impossible. There is some other explanation. The magistrate shrugged his shoulders. What other explanation could there be? What leads you to think it was a love affair? Madame Dubriol was in the habit of visiting him here in the evening, also since Monsieur Renault came to the villa. Geneve, Madame Dubriol has paid a large sum of money into the bank in notes. In all, the amount totals £4,000 of your English money. I guess that is right, said Stoner quietly. I transmitted him those sum in notes at his request, but it wasn't an intrigue. What else could it be? Blackmail, said Stoner sharply, bringing down his hand with a slam on the table. That is what it was. Oh, cried the magistrate, shaken in spite of himself. Blackmail, repeated Stoner. The old man was being blood, and at a good rate too. 4,000 in a couple of months. Wow. I told you just now there was a mystery about Renault. Evidently this Madame Dubriol knew enough of it to put the screw on. It is possible, the commissaries cried excitedly. Decidedly, it is possible. Roared Stoner, it is certain. Tell me, have you asked Mrs. Renault about this love affair stunt of yours? No, monsieur. We did not wish to occasion her any distress if it could reasonably be avoided. Distress? Why? She would laugh in your face. I tell you, she and Renault were a couple in 100. Ah, that reminds me of another point, said M. Hortet. Did Monsieur Renault take you into his confidence at all as to the dispositions of his will? I know all about it. Took it to the lawyer for him after he had drawn it out. I can give you the name of his solicitors if you want to see it. They have got it there, quite simple. Half in trust to his wife for her lifetime, the other half to his son. A few legacies. I rather think he left me 1,000. When was this will drawn up? Oh, about a year and a half ago. Would it surprise you very much, Monsieur Stoner, to hear that Monsieur Renault had made another will less than a fortnight ago? Stoner was obviously very much surprised. I would no idea of it. That is it like. The whole of his vast fortune is left unreservedly to his wife. There is no mention of his son. Mr. Stoner gave vent to a prolonged whistle. I call that rather rough on the lad. His mother adores him, of course, but to the world at large it looks rather like a want of confidence on his father's part. It will be rather galling to his pride. Still, it all goes to prove what I told you, that Renault and his wife were on first-rate terms. Quite so, said M. Hortet. It is possible. We shall have to revise our ideas on several points. We have, of course, cabled to Santiago and are expecting a reply from there any minute. In all probability, everything will then be perfectly clear and straightforward. On the other hand, if your suggestions of blackmail is true, Madame de Briolle ought to be able to give us valuable information. Poirot interjected a remark. Monsieur Stoner, the English chauffeur masters, had he been long with Monsieur Renault? Over a year. Have you any idea whether he has ever been in South America? I am quite sure he hasn't. Before coming to M. Renault, he had been for many years with some people in Gloucestershire, whom I know well. In fact, you can answer for him as being above suspicion? Absolutely. Poirot seemed somewhat crestfallen. Meanwhile, the magistrate had summoned Marchot. My compliments to Madame Renault, and I should be glad to speak to her for a few minutes. Beg her not to disturb herself. I will wait upon her upstairs. Marchot saluted and disappeared. We waited some minutes, and then, to our surprise, the door opened and Mrs. Renault, deathly pale in her heavy mourning, entered the room. M. Hortet brought forward a chair, uttering vigorously protestations, and she thanked him with a smile. Stoner was holding one hand of her in his with an eloquent sympathy words evidently failed him. Mrs. Renault turned to M. Hortet. You wish to ask me something? With your permission, Madame. I understand your husband was a French Canadian by birth. Can you tell me anything of his youth or upbringing? She shook her head. My husband was always very reticent about himself, monsieur. He came from Northwest, I know, but I fancy that he had an unhappy childhood, for he never cared to speak of that time. Our life was lived entirely in the present and the future. Was there any mystery in his past life? Mrs. Renault smiled a little and shook her head. Nothing so romantic, I am sure, monsieur. M. Hortet also smiled. True, we must not permit ourselves to get melodramatic. There is one thing more. He hesitated. Stoner broke in impetuously. They have got an extraordinary idea into their heads, Mrs. Renault. They actually fancy that Mr. Renault was carrying on an intrigue with Madame de Briolle, who, it seems, lives next door. The scarlet color flamed into Mrs. Renault's cheeks. She flung her head up, then bit her lip, her face quivering. Stoner stood, looking at her in astonishment. But M. Bex leaned forward and said gently, We regret to cause you pain, Madame, but have you any reason to believe that Madame de Briolle was your husband's mistress? With a sob of anguish, Mrs. Renault buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved convulsively. At last she lifted her head and said brokenly, She may have been. Never in all my life I have seen anything to equal the blank amazement on Stoner's face. He was thoroughly taken aback.